Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, the High Commissioner from Papua New Guinea to Australia, thank you for your address. And my very sincere thanks to Andrew and Rob from Business Advantage for inviting and enabling me to be at this conference in person. What a pleasure it is to be looking out and seeing real people in the audience rather than screens of people wondering whether they've remembered to mute themselves or not. So it is a real pleasure to be here. In beginning, can I also acknowledge that we're gathered today on the traditional lands of the Turrbal people and pay my personal respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Island people who may be in the room or watching us live stream, and also say good morning to all the people from Papua New Guinea who've come here or who may be watching live via online. My task here today is to talk about the world economy from a Papua New Guinea perspective, and my colleague Justin Smirk will be focusing on the PNG economy in more detail. But of course, in part because of the nature of its economy and the products which it produces, Papua New Guinea is inevitably affected by the cross currents in the world economy that have been particularly uncertain and challenging over the last couple of years. It's only just over 2 years ago when we first began to hear of COVID-19. And it's worth remembering in the context of things that are happening today that when COVID first hit, we didn't know what it could do to people. We didn't know how long it would take to develop safe and effective vaccines, or how widely people would be able to access them. And it was almost universally believed that the consequences of what governments felt it necessary to do in order to minimise the damage that COVID might cause to people's health and lives would result in a deep, protracted recession with an extended period of painfully high unemployment, and in all likelihood a continuation of the below average inflation that had been seen in most countries since the onset of the global financial crisis 12 years earlier. So governments and central banks around the world embarked on providing extraordinary amounts of both fiscal and monetary policy stimulus. One of the miracles of modern times is that scientists were able to develop safe and effective vaccines in a remarkably short period of time by comparison with previous medical developments, such that although the downturn in individual economies and the world economy as a whole in 2020 was the sharpest since the Great Depression of the 1930s, so too was the snapback in global economic activity of unprecedented strength. And as it turned out, the stimulus which governments and central banks around the world provided was, with the benefit of hindsight, more than was required. In saying that, I'm not criticising governments and central banks for doing what they initially did, because one of the lessons of the global financial crisis was that you can't know in advance exactly how much stimulus to provide. And given that, the right mistake to make is to err on the side of doing too much rather than too little. The mistake that governments and central banks made was in the aftermath of the very strong recoveries that economies experienced in the latter part of 2020, in keeping that stimulus in place for what, again, with the benefit of hindsight, although I would argue that it should have started to have become apparent by about this time last year, that the downturns in the world economy had not lasted nearly as long as had been feared, and that the consequences weren't as serious as had been initially feared. As a result, today the world faces a rather different challenge from the one that we had thought we would 2 years ago, one we haven't really faced in most cases for 30 or 40 years, which is very high inflation. And while some of that inflation has its origins in COVID-related disruptions to global supply chains, Some of it has been exacerbated by the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the consequences that has had for energy and a number of food prices. Ultimately, the inflation that we're seeing in developed countries and in a growing range of developing economies, including in Papua New Guinea itself, although not as much as in some others, is the result of the fact that demand from households and businesses around the world has been so strong, in part as a result of all the stimulus that is still sloshing around in most economies, that businesses faced with cost increases of the sort that I've just described, supply chains and increased commodity prices, among other things, have been able to pass those cost increases on to their customers in the form of higher prices, in a way that simply hasn't been possible for most of the last 20 or 30 years. There are, to be sure, some signs that inflation is now reaching a peak. In the US in particular, the data over the last few weeks, including last week's July consumer and producer price indexes, does hold out some hope that inflation is now passing its peak, at least in year-on-year measured terms. And that's also apparent in some developing economies such as Brazil, where inflation emerged earlier than in some other countries. That, however, doesn't tell us anything about the speed with which inflation might start now to come down towards the levels, the targets which central banks are charged by their respective governments with maintaining inflation at over the medium term. And because there is still a considerable amount of economic stimulus in most major economies, because governments are still running large budget deficits, and although interest rates have started to rise, they're still low by historical standards. Almost certainly, central banks in the major advanced economies will continue raising their policy interest rates, as they've begun to do over the last 6 months or so, by more than they already have done. The US federal funds rate, for example, will probably end up being more than 3.5% by the end of this year. And other central banks, with the exception probably of the Bank of Japan, have further to go in raising their interest rates. Some central banks are also moving to unwind the other type of monetary policy stimulus they provided during COVID, and indeed in some cases were providing during and after the global financial crisis, what economists have come to call quantitative easing, what some others perhaps more loosely call printing money, although not in the sense that countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela have made famous, but rather electronically creating money in order to purchase government bonds, in order to bring down the longer term interest rates, which central banks don't directly control, but which in many economies do provide benchmarks for example, fixed rate mortgages and business loans. In the US, the UK, and here in Australia and in Canada, central banks have said that they will now start selling off some of the bonds which they have acquired during that process. And the European Central Bank, although it's not going to sell off its bonds for fear of exacerbating differences between interest rates faced by different members of the Eurozone, has nonetheless said that it will stop buying any more. And this is likely also to put some upward pressure on long-term interest rates, and because the US Federal Reserve is being more aggressive than other central banks in unwinding its quantitative easing, it probably means further upward pressure on the US dollar against other currencies such as the euro and the Japanese yen. And given that many developing countries have debt denominated in US dollars on which they pay US interest rates, that also poses a challenge for many developing economies who've borrowed in that way. It's not just advanced economies that are putting interest rates up, however. Many developing economies began raising their policy interest rates before the US and other major advanced economies, and especially in Latin America and in Eastern and Central Europe, have put interest rates up by considerably more than the major advanced economy central banks have done. Closer to home in Asia, where inflation has been slower to pick up than in many others, Most central banks have started to raise interest rates, most recently Thailand last week. It's really only Indonesia and Vietnam now among Asian central banks who are yet to raise interest rates. In South Africa, the Reserve Bank has raised interest rates, and of course, at the end of July, Bank of Papua New Guinea initiated a rise in the Keynote facility rate, and almost certainly, as Justin will expand on in more detail, Papua New Guinea's interest rates will be influenced by what happens in the global economy as well. And because both developed and developing economies have considerably more debt now, both government and private sector debt, the impact of higher interest rates will be greater than the last occasions on which central banks were seeking to squelch inflation, which in most cases was more than 20, and in some cases as much as 40 years ago. These increases in interest rates will have, and are intended to have, a dampening impact on economic growth in the countries in which they're being administered, and because they're being administered in big countries, in most cases, they'll have an impact on the rest of the world as well. By one definition, the US economy is already in recession in the sense that it had 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth in the first half of this year. Although that's a definition that I have never liked and is not the one that is used to delineate recessions in the United States. The contractions in real GDP in the US in the first half of this year owe a lot to accounting quirks, including how the US national accounts treat the unlocking of reserves from the US's strategic petroleum reserves, and what we have seen is nothing like the last 2 occasions after the global financial crisis and during COVID, when the US experienced consecutive quarters of negative growth. In particular, it's hard to describe a period in which the unemployment rate has fallen by more than half a percentage point to its lowest level since the late 1960s, which is what has happened in the US over the last 6 months, as being a recession. But there clearly is a significant chance that the US will experience a recession in the sense that I would define it, an increase in the unemployment rate of 1.5 percentage points or more in 12 months or less at some point over the next 6 to 18 months. The Federal Reserve is confident that it can bring US inflation back down to 2% by 2024 without causing a recession, according to its most recent set of forecasts that were issued at the end of June. There'll be an update of these at the next US Federal Reserve meeting in mid-September. But the financial markets are more sceptical. For the last 4 or 5 weeks, the yield or interest rate on 2-year government bonds has been higher than that on the yield on 10-year government bonds. In other words, as they say in financial markets, the yield curve has turned negative, and that has been a reliable harbinger of every US recession in at least the last 47 years, if not longer. I would put the chance of the US experiencing a recession at around 50-50 today, depending on how much further the US Federal Reserve feels it needs to raise interest rates. By contrast, the Bank of England is being unusually forthright for a central bank in forecasting that the UK will have a recession lasting 5 quarters, pushing the unemployment rate up from less than 4% currently to over 6% by 2025. Central banks don't usually forecast recessions for fear of being accused by others, including their governments, of bringing them on merely by talking about them. That forecast is probably correct. And given Europe's exposure to painfully high gas prices, in part as a result of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, the risk of Europe experiencing a recession is probably greater than 50-50. And given how important the US and Europe still are to the world as a whole, that's a prospect that portends slower growth in the global economy. Here in Australia, and in Asia more generally over the past 20 years, we've been somewhat shielded from the effects of recessions in Europe and the United States by very strong growth in the Chinese economy. But China's economy is not in a position to offset recessions, if that's what happens in the United States and Europe over the next 2 years, given the challenges which it is facing itself, both of a short-term nature in the aftermath of COVID-19, which it almost uniquely in the world is still seeking to suppress through periodic impositions of mobility restrictions, and by the unwinding of one of the principal props in its economy over the last 10 years, namely rapid growth in real estate investment. The Chinese are looking to reduce the extent of financial risks in their economy, and as has often happened in others who've gone down that path, China is now experiencing some significant difficulties, both with real estate investment and construction, and with some parts of the financial sector that have been closely associated with that, in ways that will also weigh on medium-term economic growth. That's in part why China is one of the very few countries in the world that isn't experiencing a pickup in inflation, because demand is very weak, and one of the reasons why China is one of the few economies where interest rates aren't going up. But China also has some longer-term economic problems as well. Most of the drivers of its prior to 2010 spectacular economic performance, when it grew for 30 years at more than 10% per annum, are now either significantly slowing or turning negative. Its population is no longer growing. Its working age population is actually declining, and the proportion of its population who are in jobs is also falling. And most importantly of all, its productivity growth is slowing, as almost all of the low-hanging fruit that were there to be picked simply by moving people out of subsistence agriculture into manufacturing have now been picked. And as China, like other countries before it, becomes more services-oriented as its people become relatively more affluent, the scope for further growth in productivity in order to drive very strong rates of economic growth is now more or less exhausted. And so China's growth rate is more likely to converge to that of other middle-income economies or less. I would expect over the next 5 years China's economic growth rate to average somewhere between 3 and 5% per annum, which will still be helpful to the world economy, but not enough to offset the impact of downturns in the most advanced economies as it has done in the last 20 years. And that means that unless the conflict in Ukraine deepens or widens in ways that bring about renewed upward pressure on commodity prices, and it's beyond my pay grade to try and predict those sorts of things, for the next year or so, commodity prices, including those that matter most to Papua New Guinea, are more likely to come down from what are currently relatively high levels by historical standards than to go up. Now, over the medium term, as I'll say later in the presentation, factors such as climate change and the way in which countries will respond to that will probably create strong demand for some of Papua New Guinea's mineral exports that are very much tied into technologies that will be important in responding or adapting to climate change. And of course, there is enormous potential for Papua New Guinea's agricultural commodity exports as well, arising from changes in tastes and growth in income, particularly in the Asian region. But in the near term, at least, commodity prices are more likely to go down than up. I want to move on now from talking about purely economic factors to some other economic and geopolitical factors that I think have important implications for Papua New Guinea. I said some of this virtually at last year's conference, but it's still, I think, one of the most important issues in the medium-term outlook for the world economy. The international economy is currently going through a change that only happens rarely in recorded human history, and that is a change in the top of the international economic pecking order, if I can call it that. It was sometime in the last quarter of the 19th century when the United States overtook the United Kingdom as the world's largest economy. And the US has been the world's largest economy since then, and especially during the middle of the 20th century when so many other economies experienced the devastation of World War II. And the US, along with, for 40 years, the USSR, dominated the world economy in a way that few others have done since perhaps the Roman Empire in the first half of the first millennium. But now, whether you measure it at current market prices and exchange rates, or in the way that economic institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF do at purchasing power parities, China is overtaking the United States as the world's largest economy. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the world's richest economy. After all, there are still 5 times as many Chinese people as there are American ones, so the average American remains, and for the foreseeable future will be, significantly richer than the average Chinese. But in terms of overall economic power, China is now, and will be for the foreseeable future, the largest kid on the block. And inevitably, that rivalry, human history tells us, has a strategic and military dimension as well. So that although the US continues to spend more on its military than not only China, but the next 4 or 5 countries combined, in some important respects now, China is in a position to rival the United States, particularly in this part of the world, given that that's where China is concentrating its military prowess, whereas the US, as it now knows very much at the moment, is stretched all over the world. Of course, the US has built up over the last 70 years a network of alliances which are more widespread and involve more powerful nations than China does. So if you include the US and its friends and allies, it is still economically and militarily stronger than China and its rather smaller number of mostly less powerful allies. But nonetheless, that gap is also likely to erode over time. Perhaps we should be grateful for the fact that military might isn't the only way in which great powers exert power and influence over others and across the world as a whole. It can also be done by investment flows, in which the US has a legacy advantage, but one which is being eroded by the US's persistent external deficits, which it has to borrow through, or which it has to fund through international borrowings, so that its overall investment position continues to deteriorate quite rapidly, whereas China's gradually improves. International influence can also be exerted through aid, as we have seen the great powers seeking to do in a rivalrous way in the Western Pacific region. And of course through trade, where China is now as important as the US is as a source of imports, that is, as a market for exports for other countries. But in the agricultural and mineral and energy commodity space, China is much more important as a trading partner to the rest of the world's economies than the United States is. And this has, of course, been an important source of opportunities for Papua New Guinea as well. I think it's a good thing that Papua New Guinea has been strengthening its trade relationships with other Asian economies, as well as with China. And given the prospective slowdown in the Chinese economy over the medium term, which I referred to before, it's likely to grow by between 3 and 5% per annum over the medium term. The strongest growing economies in the world over the next 10 years are actually likely to be India, which is a difficult economy to trade with because it is still so protectionist. And apart from those, the other big economies of Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, which will record growth rates averaging in excess of 5% over the 2020s, I believe. And I think it's important for Papua New Guinea to expand to the extent it can its trading relationships with those economies, as it has been doing, very much to its credit. And of course, Australia will continue to remain an important trading partner for Papua New Guinea, in particular as a source of imports, as well as this conference is focused on today, as an important source of investment funds. Papua New Guinea occupies a very important strategically location in this increasingly contested region. China will no doubt continue in various ways to seek to pull Papua New Guinea more into its orbit, as it's been trying to do with other Pacific economies, while the West will conversely want to keep Papua New Guinea within its camp. As we've seen over the past few weeks in the aftermath of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, tensions between China and the US are likely to remain elevated, and the risk of a misunderstanding or mistake leading to something much more serious is now considerably higher than it has been at any other time in recent decades. All sorts of foreign interests are likely to be keenly interested in Papua New Guinea's strategic resources, the range of resources that the High Commissioner mentioned in his address before. In this context, it's important for Papua New Guinea to develop a clear sense of where its own strategic interests lie. As I interpreted the High Commissioner as saying on behalf of the government, that's one that will be widely shared by all strata of Papua New Guinea's society. And hopefully Papua New Guinea will be able to remain on good terms with all its neighbours, as well as with all of the major powers in the region. As the High Commissioner said in referring to the 10th of the points that the Prime Minister made in his inaugural address in Parliament, it will be important for Papua New Guinea to strengthen its state capability, the capacity of the state to look after its people in the way that the High Commissioner described, and to provide opportunities for them, the resilience of its political and legal framework, and the respect and loyalty which the state commands from its people because it's looking after them and has their best interests at heart. There may well be opportunities for Papua New Guinea to benefit from the contest or influence between competing great powers, but Papua New Guinea needs, as it doesn't need me to say this, of course, to avoid giving the impression that the country is in some way up for sale or can be bought by competing foreign interests. Papua New Guinea has enormously rich resources. It shouldn't be one of the poorest countries in the Asia-Pacific region. It has the potential to be one of the more affluent of the developing economies in the Pacific region over the long time. One of the potential opportunities to realise that potential comes from climate change. Climate change will, of course, have consequences for Papua New Guinea itself, in particular, most likely by bringing about more frequent and possibly more serious adverse weather events, and building the infrastructure to cope with that will be another of the challenges that Papua New Guinea faces. But given Papua New Guinea's enormous hydro and geothermal, as well as potentially solar and wind resources, Papua New Guinea should be aiming to become a much more significant producer of renewable energy, and either using it through new technologies such as green hydrogen, or exporting it either through cables or in liquid or other forms in order to grow its national income and benefit its people. 3 of Papua New Guinea's 4 principal mineral exports, that is to say copper, nickel and cobalt, are likely to be major beneficiaries of global efforts to reduce CO2 emissions through the increased use of batteries and through the increased use of renewable energy technologies that require these strategic metals to work to their greatest effect. And again, therefore, these are areas that, on the one hand, offer important investment and development opportunities, but also offer considerable opportunities with the right equity, participation and taxation regimes to confer significant revenue benefits to the Papua New Guinea government and to the people of Papua New Guinea. There are also enormous opportunities in agriculture and fishing. Papua New Guinea has the 5th highest per capita resources of renewable water in the world. That can be used, as I mentioned before, in hydroelectricity generation, but it also opens up enormous potential opportunities for agriculture. There was a time 40 years ago or more when Papua New Guinea was a very big producer of rice. It ought to be, and with the right policy settings, almost certainly will be a much bigger producer of rice than it is now. And the same has also been true of coffee. As Prime Minister Marape said in Australia 3 years ago. I think it might have been at the last version of these conferences. He talks about there being 3 billion people in Asia who need to drink a cup of coffee a day and who eat a plate of rice a day. And why shouldn't more of that coffee be grown and more of that rice produced in Papua New Guinea, rather than purely being energy products? And so there are enormous opportunities there, as there are in the waters around Papua New Guinea, to produce aquacultural products to improve the lives of Papua New Guinea's own people, as well as for export to countries around the region. So let me offer 3 conclusions to this conference. The year ahead will be a challenging one for Papua New Guinea. First, because global inflationary pressures, although they may have peaked, will remain intense for at least the rest of this year, and Papua New Guinea can't expect to be immune from those. Interest rates will rise further in both major advanced and developing economies, potentially in Europe and in the United States to levels that induce recessions, and in some developing economies as well. And again, Papua New Guinea as a trading nation can't expect to be immune from that. Even if the world's major central banks do manage to pull off soft landings, that is, to avoid pushing their economies into recession in the quest to bring inflation down to acceptable levels, global growth is still nonetheless going to slow, as excessive amounts of monetary and fiscal stimulus are withdrawn from the global economy. And that will result in lower prices than we see today for most commodities, including Papua New Guinea's most important export commodities. Second, geopolitical tensions are likely to remain elevated and could well increase further. In the Asia-Pacific region, and in particular the Southwest Pacific, in which Papua New Guinea is the most populous nation and the largest economy, there will be ongoing and possibly increased rivalry between the US allies and China, and that could see increased tensions arising over Taiwan. If Donald Trump or someone like him were to be returned to the White House in the 2024 election, perish the thought, countries large and small in this region will face some potentially very difficult choices. If they come to believe, as some of them were starting to believe during the Trump administration's previous term, that the US may not be a reliable ally in the event of more serious geopolitical tensions emerging in this part of the world. Third, and this will obviously be the focus of much of the rest of the conference, Papua New Guinea has enormous potential to increase its production and exports of strategic minerals, energy and food products, but achieving that potential will require, among other things, a stable political environment, coherent foreign investment and taxation policies, an increased investment in education and training, and in all sorts of transport, communications and social infrastructure. It was very good to hear the High Commissioner outline that all of these things are on the agenda for the newly installed Papua New Guinea government, and I look forward to hearing over the years about the progress being made in all of those directions. Thank you again to Business Advantage for allowing me to be part of the conference, and Andrew, if there's time to answer some questions, I'd be delighted to do that. But thank you again.
About the whole climate change global movement towards low carbon emissions by 2050. We had the COP conference in Glasgow last year. You mentioned some of the opportunities for renewable energy in Papua New Guinea, but how do you see a developing country like PNG looking at some of the other opportunities such as carbon storage, or even some of the opportunities from maintaining forests and so on? Do you see that being an important factor over the next 10, 20 years?
I certainly think forests can be. And the sort of forests that Papua New Guinea has and that Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, among others have, can play an enormous, though I think still underappreciated role as carbon sinks and as offsetting, while we're making the transition to a emissions-free world, offsetting the emissions that are still going to be continuing. And indeed, the drive to lower emissions will probably be temporarily interrupted for the next few years by the world's need to wean itself off Russian gas. And, we're seeing in Europe coal-fired power stations being reopened, and there's some pressure for that to occur in other parts of the world. So in the short term, the role of forests as carbon sinks may be even more important than it was. When it comes to carbon capture and storage, my impression, and I don't pretend to be an expert in this area, is that the hopes that have been held for commercially feasible, technologically sound ways of doing carbon capture and storage have failed to meet the hopes that have been held for them. That doesn't mean we shouldn't persist in trying to find solutions, but I think we have to say that they cannot be considered as an alternative to pursuing sustainable forms of renewable energy as the principal means of avoiding the most calamitous sorts of climate change that would occur if we don't achieve the kind of targets that were set out in the Glasgow COP and will probably be reinforced in the next series of them.